Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this episode, I am discussing something I've not discussed on an episode before, and that is pickled herring. I am really curious about pickled herring and the effects of pickled herring, and delighted to be talking with the person who is behind this book, Alex Schumacher. Alex, thank you for jumping in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to come on. I've been looking quite forward to talking about this book.
Well,
So
thank you.
thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
Glad to have you. Glad to have the space to talk about the book. And I'm always a graphic novel fan. As I mentioned, you shared a copy of the book with me, and uh, would love to take it to classrooms and share it with student readers, and just an all ages sort of graphic novel that's really enjoyable. So thank
Thank
you
you
for
so much.
putting it out into the world.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the kind words. It means the world when other readers, artists, creators enjoy something that you do. It's not more validating necessarily, but it's certainly nice to hear from other creators.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I'm curious. I know that a graphic novel takes a good deal of time. It is, as one person I talked with described it, sort of a mountain experience, sort of climbing this mountain. So I'm curious about the process of how the book came to be and how you worked on it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was thinking about it while I was creating the book, and my process really does tend to change. And, because we talk about the process of creation, and I know plenty of people who found a routine or a regimen that works for them, and they've kept it throughout their entire careers, which I admire and respect. For me, it's a little different. Because just the nature of art being unpredictable and the fact that I work on quite a few different projects. I think for me, my process is constantly evolving. So
Mm-hmm.
one thing that's constant though, and that was certainly had to be true for this book, was I always set aside dedicated time to write or draw about 5 or 6 days a week. And so with this book, there was a lot to do in a very short time. So that was increased a little bit for this book just to make sure I was on deadline. But just those are some accommodations that you find yourself having to make when you get into the midst of a project. So that's one of the examples of how it changed a little bit for me. And like I said, I set aside that time during the day, but the truth is productivity is kind of fickle. So some days
Mm-hmm.
it's working, some days it's not. And one of the most important things I think I've realized as I've gone on, some wisdom comes with age. So one of the things that I've really tried to implement a bit more, is accepting that productivity can vary. And because it can vary for so many reasons. And there was a time in my life where I was sort of intransigent about you have to work this many hours, you have to get this done. And if you don't, you're a failure. And that's just such a toxic way of thinking. So for me, it's taken me a while, but I've been trying to incorporate time for self care
Good,
more at
good.
this point. It's such an important thing that artists don't talk about because there's so much burnout in our industry, writing and comics, and we just don't talk about it enough. But we can't be our best for other people unless we're trying to make sure that or we can't be our best for people if we're not making sure we're at our best. And so I think that's something that I've really tried to focus on, at this point in my career. And that wasn't necessarily something that I did before, but especially writing for a younger audience now, because I wrote for older audiences mainly previously. So those kids deserve my best. Not that an older audience doesn't, but I think it's especially important for kids. So I guess all of that is to say my process can vary quite a bit. But for this one, it was, writing the manuscript, having my agent sell it, uh, and then kind of getting to work on it. And some of those drawing days were, 14 to 16 hours. So
Wow. Yeah.
that's a little bit more than the 6 or 7 I usually set aside. But sometimes, again, you just have to roll with it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and thank you also for being, I believe, the first person to use the word intransigent as well.
I like that word. It just trips off the tongue quite nicely.
That's right. I love that word. I love that word. We need to have like word points on the show, like
I
intransigent word there. Um, well,
do like
curious.
vocabulary.
What's that?
Is I do like vocabulary.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, curious about what draws you to particular kinds of stories and also to creating in comics because, as you mentioned, it's 12 to 14 hours some days versus 6 to 7.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll start with the comics question.
Mm-hmm.
For me, what really draws me to that art form is, like I said, I love words, I love writing, but I've also, since I was very young, been drawn to illustration. So the marriage of those two things, I couldn't think of a more perfect art form to pursue than comics. And my art style doesn't tend to follow fads or trends. So, and my stories don't necessarily either. So it can take a little longer to sort of build an audience when you're kind of digging your heels in and
Mm-hmm.
being pertinacious with your storytelling and not letting anybody dictate what you want to do. And that was the whole goal for me with doing comics. There's this Will Eisner quote, and I haven't been able to find the actual um, the credit for it, so I'm not actually sure if it's true. But the quote goes something to the effect of, "If you have an ineptitude for writing and an ineptitude for drawing, you put them together and make an aptitude for comics." So, which is a very funny quote, and I love saying it because I felt that way for a long time. But now, after having been in the comics world for almost 10 years, my first graphic novel came out when in 2013. So
Mm-hmm.
it's been over 10 years to get a second one out, but sometimes that happens. So just being able to be a part of it, I've realized that that quote is a little misleading because you kind of have to be on point with both. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's really no half-assing anything. And you shouldn't, because again, your audience deserves your best. So I just think being, drawn to books, and also, some of the first books we read, they're picture books.
Mm-hmm.
They're already kind of teaching you that vocabulary that you need to read comics, critically and think about them and kind of understand certain shortcuts that graphic novels take. So it's very exciting. It's a very exciting format for me because there's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of progress, there's so many different ways to express yourself. So I couldn't think of a better format for me. As far as what kind of directs me to a story or
Mm-hmm.
seems compelling to me, it's the story itself, sort of the plot, I guess, isn't quite as important to me as the sort of underlying story that just kind of comes from a place that's deep inside you. That is something you have to pull up from your gut. And I always zero in on small details. It's kind
Mm-hmm.
of in particular, because that's what gives you so much insight into the character and the author both. What particular toothpaste do you use, or does the character use? What time do they wake up in the morning? When does that routine start? Uh, the seeming kind of banalities of life, those really small details. For me, that's where the most interesting and important things are in a story. That's what tells you this world is lived in, and this is something that this person knows very well. Um, and that's where you connect because those are things that are based on our everyday lives and experiences, and anybody can connect on those, and that's such an important thing with storytelling. um, there are stories that kind of go, he went here, they did this, she said that, and I just feel like, and those stories are fine. Sometimes you need just cotton candy, and I
Mm-hmm.
completely get that. I do that with books, with movies, with TV all the time. Sometimes you just need to turn the brain off, so I get it. But what draws me to a story, is just, you need to know those mundanities.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the magic is really happening for me. So if that's compelling to me and that's pulling me in, then I'll read it. Genre is kind of irrelevant at that point, as long as the story is pulling me in.
Love that. Yeah. Yeah. When a story's working, it doesn't matter what kind of story it is. I love that idea.
No, absolutely, and that's for genre stuff, I do find at times it can be very plot based, and sometimes comics, depending on the series or the story, can be very plot based, and that's not a terrible thing.
Mm.
But for me, I just need the warts and all. I need to know everything about these characters. My wife kind of jokingly makes fun of me because every time I find a new band that I love, I'll go on this deep dive down the rabbit hole of finding everything out about them. How did they start? What
Right.
year was it? What was their first album? Just completely down the rabbit hole. I'll get obsessed and just listen to them nonstop. So reading for me is no different. I need all of that information. I
Mm.
crave it.
And then you start to hear some of the same guitar riffs, some of the same motifs. I love it when that happens.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you don't pick up on that unless you have, all of the information or as much data as you can possibly have.
Yeah, yeah. So, in terms of the effects of pickled herring, curious about the inspiration behind this particular book.
Mhm. Obviously there's the Jewish bent, but mostly kind of in hindsight, a lot, which is a lot when you get into your 40s. Hindsight of your career is a lot of how you tend to view things, and so looking back a little bit, um, I've kind of found that the biggest inspirations for me have always been my friends and family, and experiences that they've had, stories they've shared with me.
Mm,
And Effects of Pickled Herring is absolutely no different. I mean, it's obviously heavily based on my grandparents, my grandmother in particular, and I talk about that a little bit in the book, in the
mm,
author's. um, and the funny thing is, kind of like I was talking about before, just the mundanities or banalities of life. None of us have lived particularly fabled lives or done anything that's changed the course of humanity. Nothing that special. We're not. I'm not the most traveled. I'm not the most cultured, but we've lived, and there's a lot
mm,
of life experience counts for a lot in storytelling. At least it does for me. It's getting under the nails
mm,
uh, of those experiences, and that's where you find the good stuff when you're kind of digging through that a little bit. But especially now, kind of making a bit of a transition to kidlit, I've found that that has inspired me quite a bit. And it sort of has to, I think, to a degree, when you're writing for, adults or an older audience, shifting demographics so significantly, I think you have to have some sort of inspiration from that.
mm.
So we're also not doing them any favors by like condescending or like removing books because that's happening places.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and so they inspire me to write something that's like emotionally and mentally complex too, because they are. And I feel as though sometimes books tend to draw away from that a little bit or try to shield them from that a
mm,
little bit. Because it's like, they're on their way to adulthood, but that doesn't mean they're not fully formed people. And
yeah,
and sometimes in publishing they can be treated a little bit like less than a real person. um, but they need books that speak to them. They need books that talk about feelings that they're feelings, experiences they're experiencing, no matter how hard those might be sometimes. I think it just as much as, ethnic or religious or, cultural, uh, um, reflection in what they're seeing, the representation. Aside from just that, we need to treat them like the full formed beings that they are. We need to
mm,
speak to them on all of their levels and not just kind of the superficial ones. So that's been a huge inspiration for me, and it's been you know kind of revitalizing in a lot of
yeah.
ways. So that's that. Yeah, I think for Pickled Herring, those were my kind of two biggest inspirations and motivations.
Love it. Yeah, I love that. And very well said. I could picture you at NCTE having this conversation, actually, or AMLE or one of those,
I'd
because
be
that's
more
very
than
true.
open. Yeah. Yeah. It's just, and, I think that's been changing. That's been slowly changing with the way that graphic novels have been going. We are covering harder issues. We are talking about real things that the kids are going for. So, to be a part of that fabric is, I feel kind of honored to now, be even a small part of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the book comes out in just a few days from the time of this recording, March 26th.
Yeah, just
So
about a week.
almost out. Yeah, almost out in the world. Anything that you'd like to mention about where folks can follow along with what you're doing, as well as any other final words on the book for our talk, or work that's on the way that you'd like to sort of tease up?
Work that's on the way is easy because there's not much that I could talk about. but rest assured, there are plenty of projects in
There are
various
things.
stages of development. There always are, right? Yeah, and because I always seem to have these bursts of ideas that I'm then trying to sort of cultivate and narrow down to, sometimes you have to sort of catch and release those ideas. They don't all work.
Hmm.
Um, so various things in development right now. But people can follow along. I'm on social media, mostly Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook these days. Twitter and Instagram are at AJ Schumacher Art. I think it's just my name. You can find me on Facebook. I also have a sorely neglected website, alexschumacherart.com, which I'm hoping to be better about updating, especially now with this book coming out, and a newsletter, which is in the link trees of in the bios of all my social media.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, anything that we've missed that you want to make sure to share before we close?
I don't think so. I just hope people go out, buy it, enjoy it. People, even if it's not my book, I just want people to read, honestly.
Yeah, yeah,
It's so
true.
integral and so important. So please read my book, but just read.
Just
That's the
please
message.
read as well.
Just read. That's the message.
And middle grades graphic novels are a great space. They're not just for middle grades, they're for all ages. So
Yeah.
definitely appreciate the work you're doing in that space as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Glad to have you back anytime.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I will probably take you up on that.
All right, sounds great. It's a plan.
All right.